Okay, so our final chapter of Unit 2 is Chapter 8, and we are going to be talking about action preparation. So, in action preparation, we require some time. So, one of the things that reaction time tells us is that preparing to produce a voluntary movement takes time. Planned movement does not occur instantaneously. Certain actions and circumstances require more preparation than others. So if you guys remember back in chapter 2, we talked about reaction time and how there's a little bit of a delay before you start moving, and that's what this is talking about. So we know that task and situation characteristics can influence preparation, and this refers to that choice reaction time back in chapter 2 as well. So I'm pretty sure you can click on this hyperlink and it'll take you back to that chapter 2 component, but it basically indicates that, the more choices that you have, the slower that your reaction time is going to be, because you're going to have more things that you have to pick from. So, if you only have one choice, simple reaction time can get quite quick. But if there's like 3 or 4 choices and you have to pick the correct choice, your reaction time can increase pretty significantly, because you require time in order to anticipate which choice is needing to be made. So this concept is referred to as Hicks' law. And Hicks' law basically just says the more choices that you have, so the more choices that you need to make, the more that your reaction time is going to increase. And so there's going to be a progressive increase in your reaction time as you have more choices to make. You can see one choice, I can do it in 200 milliseconds. If I have 7 or 8 choices, we're looking at more like 600-ish milliseconds to make that reaction time choice. Next is the predictability of a correct response choice. So research evidence has consistently shown that reaction time decreases as the predictability of one of the possible choices increases. So if there becomes an obvious choice among many choices, then reaction time will decrease in relation to a scale. So let's just say an example of this could be, if you had to pick the color red every single time and you knew that red was going to be the right answer for a question or for a choice, your reaction time would decrease because you would know that red is the correct answer and not blue or not green or not yellow. So that helps you decide that you have the correct answer, and therefore your reaction time will decrease. Next, we're going to talk about the influence of the probability of pre-cue correctness. So, this is a great basketball example. And so, those of you who play basketball, you'll have a pretty good understanding of how this works. But if you are a basketball player and you're defending one-on-one against another player, and that player has to shoot or pass the ball, the defensive player has a 50-50 chance of guessing what the offensive player will do and prepare an appropriate action. But let's say the defensive player knows that the offensive player is going to shoot at a particular spot on the court 80% of the time, then they have a higher chance of getting the defensive play correct if they think that person is going to shoot. So that allows them to use probability in order to predict what's going to happen with that player. Inversely though, let's say that person is defending and that player goes to that part of the court and you think they're going to shoot, and so you do one thing, but it turns out they pass. Well, now all of a sudden your bias has changed relative to what they're doing, and your reaction time will probably be a bit slower. So if you predict correctly, if you think that you go to that area of the court and that person is going to shoot and they do, and you defend it correctly, your reaction time relative to that is going to be quicker. But if you predict incorrectly and they pass when you think they're going to shoot, the next time that they do that to you, you're probably going to react a little bit more slowly. So if you predict the pre-Q well, you will have shorter reaction time. If you don't predict it well, you will have slower reaction time. So that's kind of this more involved example here with the basketball example noted here. So this is just as a result of the thing I was just talking about earlier, but this is your cost-benefit trade-off. So when you were correct, there was a benefit, so your reaction time was faster if they had not biased their responses. But if you were wrong, there was a cost, so your reaction time was slower. So this is basically exactly what I was saying. You know, the defensive player predicts correctly, the reaction time is quicker. They predict incorrectly, the reaction time is slower. So next we're going to talk about stimulus response compatibility. If you guys kind of break down this term a little bit more, you can see that there's a stimulus, so there's something that is, you know, afferent. You're getting a stimulus that is coming towards you, and then your response would be like your efferent. So how are you responding to it? How are you reacting to that? And then how compatible is that stimulus and that response? So if you have a compatible stimulus and response, your reaction time will be faster as the relationship between that stimulus and the required response becomes more compatible. Conversely, your reaction time will be slower as this relationship becomes less compatible. So let's talk about some examples here. So there's a spatial relationship effect, and an example of that would be that a person has to push one of 3 keys in response to the illumination of one of 3 lights. If the keys and lights are arranged horizontally with the key to be pushed located under the light indicating that response, then the situation is more compatible than if the lights are vertical and the buttons are horizontal. The more compatible the relationship is, the more quickly your reaction time will be and the fewer errors you're going to see. So I'm going to show you guys an example of this below because we're going to scroll past a couple things here. We're going to come back up to that. So this is that spatial relationship effect right here. So if the stimulus response compatibility is high, let's say your burners on your oven at home, you're going to start to see that, you know, your controls are the same as where the burners are, right? So you know that top left is here, you know the bottom right's here, versus in this example, which we often see on ovens and stoves, is that the controls are all in a line, but the burners are shown like this. So sometimes you have to look a little bit more closely. It takes a little bit more time, especially if you're not familiar with it. It might take you a second or two longer in order to adjust the heat on one of these burners because the controls are not compatible with the shape of the stove top like this one would be. So if your controls are like this, it's really easy. You don't even have to think about it. You just know top left is top left or bottom right is bottom right, and you just make that adjustment really quickly. So that's the spatial relationship effect. Next, we're going to talk about the Stroop effect, which is a phenomenon that occurs when a person must verbally respond to the ink color of a word that names a color. So, you know, if I show you a word and it says the word blue, but the word blue is actually the color red, you need to tell me that the color of the word is red, even though the word is blue. So I would just go Google this. There's YouTube videos on this. I had a link in here, and I might be able to show you guys this in class on a Wednesday. But this is the Stroop effect, kind of an interesting experiment. You guys may or may not have done it at some point in your lives. So next we're going to ask, why does stimulus response compatibility affect reaction time? Well, it makes sense, right? If we look at this burner example back down here, is that you are more likely to make mistakes with this example on the right because it's not compatible. They don't look the same. the stimulus and the response are not similar. So your likelihood of making a mistake is higher, so you're going to spend more time in order to make the proper selection. So that's basically where that concept comes from. Next, we are going to talk about for period and length regularity. So as we talked about in reaction time back in chapter 2, there's a warning signal or a go signal, and that's called the for period. So if the for period is a constant length, or if it's the same amount of time every single time, that go response, your reaction time will eventually shorten as time goes on. So if we think about like this swimming example, there's going to be like a ready and then a go, or like a gunshot or something like that forces a person to start moving. If you know that's consistent every single time, eventually you're going to be able to predict when that's happening, and you're going to get better at doing that. But if, I said 3, 2, 1, go, but I waited a different period of time each time before I said go, your reaction time will change and eventually decrease because you're going to take more time to predict when that's going to happen. So again, we can attribute shorter reaction time associated to constant for periods because they can anticipate when that's going to happen, right? When you can anticipate when that go signal is coming, you're going to be able to react much more quickly. Next, we're going to talk about movement complexity. And so the complexity of the action to be performed influences the amount of time a person requires to prepare the motor control system, right? So if it's just running, like I just need to run in a straight line, you don't really need to prepare to do that because it's not super complex. You're just running in a very, very straight line. But if you're doing like a dance routine or anything of that sort, you are going to require a bit more time to prepare that movement, right? Another example of this might be figure skating. We're trying to do a big complex jump, let's say like a triple axel. You can see as that skater comes into that jump, there's a bit of a delay as they prepare into that complex skill, right? They almost take a second to glide and then they make the jump. They're not doing that just out of nowhere. Next is movement accuracy. So as the accuracy demands for a movement increase, the amount of preparation time required also increases, right? So if you need to do something that's really, really accurate, like if you're doing like brain surgery, you're going to take some time to make sure that you're doing that properly, versus if you're just trying to kick a soccer ball into a soccer net from like 3 feet away from the net, you can just boot that thing as hard as you want, wherever you want to. There's a 99% chance it's going in the net. So just less preparation required for less complex and less accurate skills. Next is the repetition of a movement. So well-known characteristic of human performance is when a performance situation requires a person to repeat the same response on the next attempt, that person's reaction time for the next trial will be faster than the previous attempt. So that kind of just shows you that, like, if you know what you're getting into, if you can understand that you're going to be doing the same thing over and over and over, then your reaction time generally will improve as time goes on. Next is the time between different responses to different signals. So an example of this is when a basketball player is confronted by a defensive player in a one-on-one situation. He or she might fake a move in one direction before moving the opposite direction. So the fake is the first signal, and the movement in the opposite direction is the second signal. Each signal by the offensive player requires the defensive player to initiate a movement. So in this situation, reaction time will be slower for the defensive player's second movement than for his or her first, which makes sense. When you fake somebody out and they go one way and you kind of break their ankles, they move a lot more slowly on the second move, right? Like, it takes them a lot more time to actually get back and move back towards the direction they need to be going. So this reaction time delay for the second movement is due to this psychological refractory period, which can be thought of as a delay period during which a person cannot select the second movement until after he or she selects and initiates the first. As such, the psychological refractory period reflects a distinct limitation in action preparation process. Right? So you need to be able to complete and initiate that first move in order to be able to process and complete the second move. That's why our brains can only do a couple things at a time. It doesn't have the capacity to make that sudden shift versus the offensive player who can predict, well, I know I'm going to fake this person out. The defensive player has no idea, so it's a lot easier for the offensive player to make that second move versus the defensive player. So this figure 8.3 is just kind of denoting that psychological refractory period. So you can actually see that you can see how the first player, the offensive player, will fake, and then it requires you this much more time in order to actually get to the point where you're going to start reacting to the second move. So it's not always the most clear thing in the world, but it helps you guys understand that your brain requires time to process these different actions and skills, especially when you're trying to react to something else happening around you. So next we're going to talk about performer characteristics and how they influence preparation. So we're going to kind of just quickly go through these parts. I don't want to spend too much detail on this. So the first part is the alertness of the performer. So if you're feeling dopey and tired and you had a crappy sleep and you haven't had your morning coffee, your reaction time is going to be poor because your ability to respond to that stimulus is not going to be as great. The next is vigilance. So in vigilance situations, an individual must perform an appropriate action when he or she detects a signal to act. The problem is that signals occur very infrequently or irregularly. So there are many vigilance situations in motor skill performance contexts. So in sports, a situation involving vigilance occurs when baseball outfielders must maintain alertness throughout an inning in the field, despite having only one ball hit their way out of many pitches thrown. So, that's a great example of vigilance, is just saying, well, I still need to pay attention, but if I'm feeling dopey or tired or not paying attention and I'm sitting out in the outfield and all of a sudden the ball gets hit towards me and I'm not paying attention, well, now my vigilance is low, so I'm not going to be able to react appropriately to that ball being hit towards me. Next is what occurs during preparation. So if we go back to chapter 2, you guys can see that there are different parts of an action that relate to your muscle activity, right? So there's like a premotor component where you actually start to see a little bit of motor activity and a little bit of those like squiggly lines going up and down and that EMG signal prior to the actual muscle moving. So this is called fractionating reaction time. We're breaking down reaction time into different components. So again, just kind of touch base on that EMG component back in chapter 2. That will help you tie back into this part in chapter 8. Next, we're going to talk about postural preparation, and postural preparation is the process commonly referred to as anticipatory postural adjustments. So the term anticipatory indicates that prior to the execution of the intended action or movement, there are additional muscles that activate, which is a process that occurs non-consciously. So this can relate back to kind of like a catching example, where you're having to kind of adjust your arms and your hands accordingly based on how that ball and how quickly that ball and where that ball is arriving to your hands. The next is the preparation of limb movement characteristics. So an essential part of the action preparation process is selecting and organizing the specific movement characteristics of the limbs to perform according to the dictates of task constraints and characteristics. Because an individual often can perform the same action using several different limbs or different segments of the same limb, he or she must specify and prepare the limb or limb segments to be involved in performing a given task. So again, with catching, you're just preparing your hands, your arms, your elbows, your shoulders, your body position, all of that stuff in order to complete the task. So, the preparation of movements for object control involve two features that help you with movement preparation. So the first is force control. So an important movement feature prepared prior to manipulating an object is setting the amount of force required to lift or move the object. Right? So if you think about picking up a weight in the gym, you're going to look at that weight, you're going to prepare yourself to be able to move a weight a particular amount and how much force is going to be required to do that, versus, let's say, picking up a pen off the ground. You're going to make an assessment of that, and you're going to be able to use force control in order to prepare yourself for that movement. The second part is end state comfort control. So you're basically, when you pick something up, you're trying to decide what would be the most comfortable way for me to pick this up so I'm not contorting myself around. So when you go to pick up a mug, you will pick it up in a certain orientation so that it sits in your hand comfortably and your wrist is in a comfortable position. We are always making these little adjustments in the way that we pick something up in order for us to be comfortable and have that end state comfort control when we pick up an object. So think about that when you pick up something next time. It's like, well, I'm probably picking this up just to make my life more comfortable when I do actually physically get it in my hand, and you're not picking it up in a really awkward position while you do that. Next is the preparation of sequences of movements. So there's two types of research evidence that indicate that short sequences of these movements are prepared in advance of the initial movement. One is the systematic increase in reaction time as movement complexity increases, which we discussed earlier in this chapter. And the other evidence is that the kinematic characteristics of the hand and finger movements during typing and piano playing and the lips, tongue, and jaw during speaking are modified by what elements of the sequence of movements come before or after them. So you are constantly preparing these sequences of movements, and this shows like kind of the complexity of speech, because even as I'm talking to you right now and I'm trying to describe what we're doing in regards to this motor skill acquisition, I am preparing to speak the next word. So I am orienting my tongue and my lips and my mouth in a way that allows me to continuously speak into this microphone so that you guys can try to understand what I'm saying. And I don't always do a perfect job of that, so I apologize. But I also think that this is kind of a neat way of thinking about how complex our brains and how complex motor skill acquisition can be at times. And we don't even realize that we do some of these things just completely unconsciously. So it's kind of a cool concept. So now we're going to make a bit more of a clinical example. So we've talked about Parkinson's disease before. So an example of this would be if someone with Parkinson's disease is moving slowly when performing a movement sequence. So these guys did this Smiley, Oyen, Kerr, and Lowry in 2007 did an analysis of adults with Parkinson's disease performing sequential manual aiming movements to 1, 3, 5, and 7 targets showed that the slow movement speed was due to both movement planning and execution strategies. So we're basically just implying that people's ability to prepare movement, especially when they have a movement disorder and a movement condition like Parkinson's disease, is decreased. So it kind of shows you the importance of movement preparation when people are doing any particular task and how it can be affected by certain conditions. Next is the rhythmicity preparation. So many skills require that the component movements follow specific rhythmic patterns. So we might look at stuff like walking or free throws, or someone's golf routine before they hit the shot. Like there's lots of different things that we can look at, and how people use rhythm in order to prepare their movements for a particular skill. Final part here is this study by Cotterill, Sanders, and Collins in 2010 that used elite golfers in England, and they interviewed about their pre-performance routines. So there was 2 results that were especially relevant to this discussion. First, the use of rhythm was commonly indicated as part of the routine. For example, one golfer stated that prior to a shot, he would say, "I then step in, set up, and 1, 2. I just think 1, 2, 1, 2. The words occupy my mind while the rhythm is timed for my backswing and forward swing." And then secondly, the interviews indicated not only the differences in individuals of the routines that were used, but also the consistency within the individual golfers and the use of their routines. So we know that routine and movement preparation are important when we're performing a skill. And so this is just an example of that movement preparation. So, you know, I really like golf. I used to play for the Rattlers golf team way back when, and so I like to use golf examples as much as possible, so I apologize for that. But I think this gives you guys a good indication of a sport where people do have a routine. I know, like in basketball with free throws, people generally have a routine with that as well. So that's something that you guys can think about as you talk about reaction time and movement preparation relative to Chapter 8, and then tying it back to all the content we've covered so far. So that is the end of Chapter 8, and we will be starting up Unit 3 on Chapter 9 and 10.